Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up sounding so bad. Well, I tried using a shotgun mic on my camera in order to keep my main mic out of the video, and I didn't give myself enough time to play around with the settings to get them properly dialed in before recording actual footage with it. The audio I got out of it was okay, but it's a noticeable drop from the quality of my usual audio, so I thought it would be odd if I didn't at least acknowledge it here.
Today, I'm gonna riff for a bit. And by riff, I don't mean what most people usually mean when they say riff and just talk off the cuff. What I actually mean is that I'm not responding to anyone today, it's just me. But I'm still scripted because I'm bad when I'm not scripted. Today, I'm just going to be discussing the Christian persecution complex, because honestly, I'm having a hard time understanding the amount of cognitive dissonance that goes into seeing yourself as persecuted when you are a member of the majority religion in a country, a religion that often enjoys special privileges that no other religion enjoys. And as is probably obvious already, I am mostly talking about American Christians here, as there are cultural differences in different parts of the world that can affect some of what I'm saying here. Also, I know there is diversity of opinion among Christians, even in America, so keep in mind that I am not trying to paint every Christian with the same broad brushstrokes, but there is some generalization going on here that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but can be largely true. Anyway, let's go! There are a number of things that have happened recently that have made me want to talk about this. Everything from a youth group on a missions trip bothering passengers on an airplane with worship music, to the Supreme Court taking up the case of a coach praying after games at the 50-yard line. And somehow, in this world where they are free to annoy a captive audience, can't get much more captive than locked in a tube thousands of meters above the ground, they're free to stand on the street corners and preach loudly at passers-by, there's 88% of Congress identifying as Christian when only 65% of the general population do, which makes them a massively overrepresented group in government, where there are stories repeatedly surfacing of children being bullied by Christian teachers for not being Christian, with the teachers largely escaping with nothing more than a slap on the wrist, if that. Meanwhile, it's not unheard of for people in religious minorities to end up being discriminated against, threatened, and in some cases even driven out of town should they dare to stand up for what are supposed to be their constitutionally protected rights. And yet, in this culture where Christianity enjoys such a privileged position, they constantly are churning out movies like the God's Not Dead franchise, which paints a picture of Christians being persecuted just for believing what their religion teaches.
Future Rhino cutting in for a sec. Just thought I'd give you an update on the guitar on a plane guy. He has indeed come out and claimed that all the criticism of him annoying passengers with an unwanted captive live performance is persecution. Never mind that I think anyone who would do something like that, regardless of the music, would be obnoxious, but because he was allowed by the flight crew to do it, but people have since pointed out that it was rude and obnoxious, he is persecuted. I feel like I'll never be done with this video because every time I finish editing it, some new Christians are being persecuted story drops.
Often casting the ACLU as the bad guys, because often one of the things that the ACLU does is defend people of minority religions from people working in government positions who try to impose their religion onto them. But let's look at how the movie God's Not Dead 2 portrays the ACLU.
How do we make this go away and not get blood on our hands?
That's the easy part. We let the ACLU do it. They'll file suit against Ms. Wesley, and if she's found liable, which she will be, then we fire her for cause.
I'm not forgetting the financial opportunities.
Yes? Miss Wesley is an employee of the school board. We went in court and we established her misconduct as said paid employee. Well, there's nothing that changes policy faster than a big expensive settlement. We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead.
Now, here in the real world, if something like the plot of God's Not Dead 2 happened, the ACLU would be defending the teacher in that situation. The student asked if the scenario that was being described in class was what Jesus meant when he said we should love our enemies. The teacher responds with a yes, quotes the relevant Bible passage, does not say that that's what she believes, but instead quotes it as what the author of Matthew reports Jesus to have said, and then ties it back into the lesson by pointing out that Martin Luther King Jr. believed that that is what Jesus meant. Student asks a question, teacher answers it, and then goes back to teaching.
But what makes nonviolence so radical is its unwavering commitment to a nonviolent approach, not just initially, but in the face of escalating persecution by the opposing force. Yes.
Isn't that sort of like what Jesus meant when he said that we should love our enemies?
Yes. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew records Jesus as saying, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you will be children of your Father in heaven," which indicates a commitment to nonviolence. Dr. King confirmed the link, describing his inspiration from Scripture, saying, Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method.
But even though the real-world ACLU would be defending the teacher in this scenario, in the persecution complex world of Christian media, anyone who is a Christian must go through hardships brought against them by the world so that the tables are turned and the teacher gets sued. But that's the way it has to be in Christianity. They have to manufacture persecution when none exists, because if none exists, then they aren't Christianing properly, because the idea that Christians will be persecuted is repeated over and over again throughout the New Testament. Matthew 5:10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:44, the verse that is quoted by the teacher in God's Not Dead 2, ends with, "Pray for those who persecute you." Luke 6:22, "Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man." 2 Timothy 3:12, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." 1 John 3:13, "Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you." And I could go on and on. I legitimately had to cut a lot of verses about persecution just to keep it within this video here. These are just a small selection of the verses telling Christians that they should expect to be persecuted, with some even being in the sections that are titled Marks of the True Christian. This leaves people with the idea that if they are not being persecuted, then they are not true Christians. And so therein lies the problem. If they are not being persecuted, if the world doesn't hate them, then they aren't true Christians. So what is one to do when one is a member of the majority religious demographic, but in order to get into eternal paradise, you have to be a true member of that demographic, and in order to be a true member of that demographic, you have to suffer persecution? Well, that's when you start seeing persecution in places where it doesn't exist. They have to look at the loss of privileges as though that is itself persecution. I'm not allowed to force my students to pray before class? Persecution. I'm not allowed to deny marriage licenses because I don't think gay people should get married? Persecution. Churches need to agree not to endorse political candidates if they want to remain tax exempt? Persecution. Never mind that a Muslim teacher is also not allowed to force students to pray before class. Never mind that a Muslim clerk would also not be allowed to deny marriage licenses based on their personal feelings about the couple. Never mind that mosques are also subject to the Johnson Amendment. If Christians and Christian organizations can't have these special privileges, it's persecution. And heaven forbid that a law should at some point apply to a Christian. Take one of the side plots from God's Not Dead 2. I watched that whole goddamn steaming pile of garbage just to find the couple of clips that I've already used, so I'm bloody well gonna be using more clips from them to make the endeavor worthwhile. Or at least less wasteful. Anyway, they have a side plot that has to do with that time in Houston when 5 pastors had some of their sermons subpoenaed. How it played out in reality is that Houston had just passed the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, which simply serves to ban discrimination based on sex, race, color, ethnicity, national origin, age, religion, disability, pregnancy and genetic information, as well as family, marital, or military status. This ban on discrimination already applies federally. They were just making it explicit for their city as well. And, of course, religious institutions were exempt from this ban. So they're still allowed to say that you have to have a penis in order to be a priest. They don't have to perform gay marriages, etc., etc. But even though they were explicitly exempted from having to follow that law, they still collected signatures on a petition to put a repeal measure on the ballot for the ordinance. The petition was largely organized by a handful of churches. But there were problems with the signatures that they collected, which left them with about 2,000 valid signatures shy of the 17,000 signatures required to put the repeal measure on the ballot. Then, the Alliance Defending Freedom got involved, and they sued Houston to, and I can't stress this enough, put a hold on an ordinance that guarantees equal rights for everyone, but with exceptions for religion already built in so that churches are still free to discriminate. This ordinance would not have affected them in the slightest. They were explicitly allowed to violate it because of their religion. And on top of all of that, it's basically just a duplicate of what the federal rules already are. So effectively, the ordinance is just the city of Houston saying, yeah, we agree with that federal thing. But the church can't allow other people to have equal rights, not when those people are people that they disapprove of, even if those people have nothing to do with them in the first place. So they sued the city. As part of the discovery process, the city then subpoenaed the sermons of 5 pastors. But it wasn't all of their sermons, it was just the ones that were relevant to anything they might have said regarding the ordinance. The purpose of the subpoenas was to determine what sort of instructions the pastors had given to their congregants with regards to collecting signatures and signing the petition themselves. They were doing this in order to determine how many of the signatures are valid. In other words, if they had done everything properly, then the subpoenaed sermons would reveal that, and the formerly invalid signatures could then be validated, and their repeal measure would then be put on the ballot. Eventually, they put up such a stink about the possibility that they might have to turn over relevant information as part of the discovery process of a lawsuit that they initiated, that the city just dropped the subpoenas to avoid having to deal with it. So the reality of the situation is that a law applied to a church, the church didn't like that, so they complained until it was decided that making the law actually apply to them was more trouble than it was worth. In the end, they got their repeal measure, and when asked if everyone should have equal rights regardless of race, religion, sex orientation, etc., the citizens of Houston voted no. They should not have equal rights. Though Houston is a pretty liberal city in general, so rather than attributing this to the citizens of Houston, I'd be more comfortable attributing it to the fact that churches were making a huge fuss about this whole thing, and if there's one thing that churches are good at, it's getting their parishioners out to vote. So that was likely a turnout issue more than a citizens of Houston are all a bunch of bigots issue. Moral of the story there is, please vote. Please. But now that we've seen what actually happened, let's look at how God's Not Dead portrayed it, and with apologies in advance, I will be breaking in fairly regularly, as this was a pretty big budget movie. Okay, it wasn't a big budget movie, but for a Christian movie, it was a big budget movie. The copyright bots tend to be more strict with these sorts of things. My use does fall firmly under fair use, but it's always best to avoid a claim in the first place rather than have to deal with the aftermath of one. So first, we get the pastors discussing the subpoenas of the sermons.
Prosecutor's office about a subpoena that just came down, demanding that we submit copies of our sermons for the last 3 months for review.
So to start off with, they're saying that they want all of their sermons from the last 3 months, not just sermons for a specific relevant topic.
They tried it in Houston.
And there we get the reference to Houston. It's the slippery slope fallacy. They subpoenaed specific sermons with a specific purpose in Houston. Now they're subpoenaing all the sermons regardless of topic. Now, for the record, the subpoena that they're describing in this movie, that would be unconstitutional, and if that one were to actually happen, the ACLU would absolutely be defending these pastors against it.
So now the government can determine what we can and can't preach at our churches?
No, that was not the point of the Houston subpoena. Y'all are allowed to be a bunch of hate-filled bigots if you want. That is constitutionally protected. They just wanted information on instructions provided from the pulpit that would help in determining the validity of signatures on a petition. If they wanted to keep their sermons from being subpoenaed, the easiest method would have been for them to actually adhere to the Johnson Amendment and not use their sermons for political purposes. And notably, the city of Houston was not even considering revoking their tax-exempt status, even though this would have constituted a clear violation of the Johnson Amendment. They just wanted to validate the bloody signatures.
We stand by and do nothing. The pressure that we're feeling today is going to mean persecution tomorrow.
What makes you so sure?
Viciousness of the opposition. The message of the gospel has us standing in the way of a lot of things that powerful people want. And our resistance to change that message, because it's not ours to change, has made us a lot of enemies.
And there, we get a direct reference to the slippery slope. Today, it's just subpoenaing our sermons, but our faith has us opposing a bunch of really powerful people. Never mind that the most powerful people in the country share that faith with you. That's not important. What's important here is that we really are being persecuted, or are at least headed there. Then, when Pastor Discount Owen Wilson, I can't remember his character's name, so that'll have to do, when he goes to the office to turn in his sermons, all he does is turn in a letter explaining why he's refusing to turn in his sermons. And rather than it just being some bored clerk who wouldn't have really cared about all this, we get this scene.
Those are your entire sermons for the past 120 days?
No, that's a letter that I wrote explaining why I'm not going to hand them in.
Excuse me?
I know it's unusual for a Christian pastor to willfully resist a subpoena issued by a lawful government authority. And it's even more unusual that he should feel compelled to do so.
Ha! Yeah, right. If there's one thing that COVID has taught me, it's that a Christian pastor disobeying laws that apply equally to everyone is a perfectly normal occurrence, and they usually get away with it. Occasionally, there's a little slap on the wrists, but then the cries of persecution come flooding in until any sort of consequence for their actions are completely revoked. Back to the scene.
It's something that I have to do.
You know the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, don't you? I have another saying. A nail that sticks up gets hammered down.
So, I'm going to admit here that I don't really know how handing in a subpoena document would work, but I feel like it would either be by mail, or if you did go into the office, it would be a bored clerk who wouldn't even have commented on the lack of thickness in the envelope. At worst, you might get a warning that's like, you sure about this? You might end up being held in contempt of court. The Christian media would have us believe that Christianity is on the verge of being made illegal, so it's important to fight against every little thing that they perceive as a slight against them, because if we're complacent today, we'll be illegal tomorrow.
Christians are soon going to be forced to choose between obeying the law of man or following the word of God.
If we're going to insist that a Christian's right to believe is subordinate to all other rights, then it's not a right.
Now, I also want to touch on the lyrics of the song that they play at the end of the movie, but for what I think would be obvious reasons, I'm not going to play the actual audio. But some of the lyrics are, when did it become breaking a rule to say your name out loud in school? It didn't, but they ask that question anyway, but then he follows it up with, even if it gets me convicted, I'll be on my knees with my hands lifted. And there are lots of other lyrics like that in this song, but really that last line could have been a reference to giving a blowjob in public rather than being persecuted, because, you know, that could get you convicted of a public indecency charge. So I guess different strokes for different folks, I guess? But what really gets me confused in all of this, okay, well, I'm not really confused about it itself, but I am confused about how they justify it to themselves. But right beside pretty much every single one of the persecution passages in the Bible is a statement about how that's a good thing. You need to be willing to endure the persecution. Not fight against it, but revel in the fact that it happens. Do not resist the one who is evil. If he slaps you on your cheek, turn the other one. If he sues you for your tunic, give him your cloak as well. If he forces you to walk a mile, go 2. The verse from the movie, Matthew 5:44, is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Not fight them, pray for them. Luke 6:22, blessed are you when people hate, exclude, and revile you. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. 2 Corinthians 12:10, for the sake of Christ, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, I am strong. And so it goes. The Bible does not say to fight against persecution, as we see the protagonists of movies like God's Not Dead doing. It tells you to embrace it, submit to it, be humbled by it. The authors of the New Testament would be absolutely disgusted with the state of modern Christianity and what modern Christians think is persecution. But I guess when you're born into a religion where the true believers are supposed to be persecuted by the world, but the persecution doesn't really exist, you do need to find it somewhere, otherwise you're not a true believer. But then, in order to actually be persecuted, you'd have to actually give something up, and they're generally not willing to do that. So, rather than be glad for the persecution like the Bible tells them to, they fight it tooth and nail while trying to get their followers worked up into a fervor to support them, both spiritually and financially. Because nothing screams persecution like making a movie that earned 55 times what it cost to make it in the first place. Okay, that's not fair. That was the first God's Not Dead persecution masturbation session. The second one did much, much worse. It only made 4.7 times what it cost to make it. I wonder if that counts as persecution. I would gladly suffer the amounts of persecution that American Christians face if it'll put millions of dollars in my pocket. And even as I write the script for this, more videos are coming out, specifically in this case, a video of a man preaching the gospel loudly at a group of people that had just finished watching Spider-Man. Nobody tried to stop him, nobody spoke to him, he just gets to yell at the crowd of people about his faith, and everyone just has to accept that we live in a world where that happens sometimes. But what a lot of Christians would have us believe is that this man not being allowed to force the audience to stay and listen to him preach would somehow amount to persecution. Now, of course, this does not apply to all Christians. Many are happy with the freedoms that they have, and they recognize that the separation of church and state exists as much to protect them as it does to protect other religions and the lack of religion. After all, there are literally thousands of different Christian denominations, so even if the government embraced Christianity, the chances are high that it would be a flavor of Christianity that most Christians would disagree with on some fundamental level. So, keeping the government out of religion is just as important as keeping religion out of the government. Though I would argue that some oversight to ensure that churches are actually earning their status as tax-exempt organizations would definitely be in order. Nothing crazy, just the same amount of oversight that goes into the non-religious charities. But we all know how much they would protest if a law were to be applied equally to them, so that's not likely to happen anytime soon. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Hellshade2, who says, "In regards to this coach wanting to pray at the 50-yard line, I say if he wants to pray to some mythological deity, that's his business, as long as he's not requiring his teams to pray to his mythological deity as well. The teams should be able to pray to whatever mythos they prefer, or to none at all if they want to." This was from my live stream where I talked about the Supreme Court taking on the case of this coach. The issue here is not the prayer itself. It's the fact that he's a coach, an employee of a public school, so he is a government employee. And the way he was going about his prayer would, whether he wanted it to or not, put pressure on the students that he was coaching to join him. Which then creates a dynamic where a government employee is pressuring students to take part in a religious ritual that could have been done privately, but which this coach decided to do very, very publicly. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the law that applies to the Christian that is my channel. If you'd like to be persecuted, or doing the persecuting, I guess would be in that scenario, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!